We need to know where we are before we can think about where we're going. And the Episcopal Church has been plagued, in my view, by a certain lack of realism over the last couple of decades, due in large part to a lack of information. We simply just have not had the information about what's happening in the church to our people. So let's begin with the long view of what's been happened to the church since the 1950s. So this chart takes us back to 1951. And as you can see, in the Episcopal Church, as with all other denominations, mainline, conservative, whatever, the peak, or the fastest growth, was in the 1950s, driven by suburbanization, people coming back from the war, massive increase in the birth rate. All these things sort of conspired together so that there was an unusual, unprecedented growth in all churches, not just the Episcopal Church. But it wasn't simply the birth rate, because we were growing actually almost double the rate of the birth rate. So we were gathering in formerly unchurched people in a large extent as people moved into the suburbs and began to have families. Now then, in the mid-1960s, things changed. A lot of the kids that were grown up in these high households started going off to college. There was this thing called the pill that ended up lowering the birth rate rather phenomenally. And the culture changed as well, so that institutions, particularly established institutions, were called the establishment, and people drifted away from those. So you had all these things coming together, and all denominations experienced significant declines, at least in their rate of growth, and eventually actually began to decline in overall membership and attendance. And then things sort of, the worst of this was in the early 70s, and then things kind of stabled out into a slow decline. Now there's two lines here. This is the year that the non-domestic dioceses were removed and membership definition changed from just baptized membership to active baptized membership. So we basically lost on the books about 500,000 people in 1 year. So sometimes you read in the press, oh, the Episcopal Church lost X number of members, over a period of time, but they rarely take into consideration this sort of accounting change that occurred during this period. After that, the decline was rather slow. If you look at it in a more recent time period, you see a rather slow decline in this period, and then a time of stability in which there was actually 1 year of growth I think in about 2000, 2001, and then in 2002 decline began again at a minimal level and then has accelerated and at about the same rate of decline every year since. I should add that this period of stability here was really unprecedented among mainline denominations. All other mainline denominations were actually declining quite severely during this period, whereas the Episcopal Church was actually showing some growth for a few years. So while we gloated during that period about how we're doing so well and you're doing so poorly, it just was a matter of time before things began to catch up. What was happening during that period was that there was a fair number of increase of Roman Catholics switching into the Episcopal Church, but also there was a influx of, I would say, sort of people from the baby boom, my generation, who had not been in the church for a while, who came back into the church. And the Episcopal Church got a lot of those individuals, or seekers, or baby boomers exploring their spirituality. Not just the Episcopal Church, but interestingly, Unitarian Church also increased during the same period. Now, those look at the overall churches. Now, if we bring this back down to congregations themselves, that is, we don't deal with churches leaving the Episcopal Church. I put that in quotation marks because you can't really leave, you know. People can leave, churches can't. But nevertheless, if this is the all churches that were there 5 years ago and that are continuing to be there. And in 1997, this is the percent of churches that declined by 10% over the previous 5 years. And this is the percent that grew by 10% or more during the previous 5 years. As you can see, these are fairly close together. And in the 2001, 2002, 2003, they were very similar. In fact, in 2002, over the previous 5 years, we had just about as many churches growing as we did declining. And in this time, we actually had the growth of the churches that were growing numerically, that is, in terms of the number of people were added, exceeded the decline of the ones that were declining. But since then, beginning in 2003, 4, and so on, the percentage of churches that have declined 10% or more steadily grew, and then it sort of plateaued over the last 4 years. This doesn't deal at all with new churches, nor with churches that have closed or left or anything like that. So a lot more of our churches are having problems today than they were just 6, 7 years ago. It is a big change. This looks at worship attendance. Now, worship attendance is much more volatile than membership. Churches keep people on their membership rolls sometimes for an exceedingly long time. You know, we had a flat period here. Now, I must say that we've only had attendance data, decent attendance data, since 1991. So you really can't go beyond this, unfortunately. But there was slow decline here and stability, and then actually a few years of pretty decent growth in this period right before 2002, and then things began to dip a bit in 2002, a modest decline, and then a much more serious drop in the years since. There is some bumps around here where things weren't quite as bad, but that's due to what I call the Christmas effect. Anybody know what the Christmas effect is? No. Yeah. So basically, it's almost if Christmas falls like on a Monday, you count the Christmas Eve service as well as a Sunday service. So it almost is like adding another weekend to worship, and so that the decline doesn't tend to be as bad during those years. But nevertheless, the overall decline on a percentage basis is more extreme for attendance than it is for membership. And of course, this does include our problems with dioceses like Fort Worth and Quincy and San Joaquin and what's the other one? Pittsburgh. This is included in there, but and it varies from year to year, the effect of that, but not more than, say, 20%, at least of this past year, has been a result of that decline. When Fort Worth, which was the largest diocese that tried to defect, but brought out those members. It's not that they didn't try to leave several years ago, but adjusting to books, that we kept those churches on the rolls basically until they were declared non-filing. They're still listed as Episcopal congregations, but they're simply not included in the statistics. Okay, so a period of a fairly rapid decline year after year since 2003. And this shows it even more impressively, I think. This is the actual congregations, what's happening to churches. So that in 2002, 31% of our congregations had at least 10% increase over the previous 5 years. So whereas in 2010, that had been reduced to only 17% of congregations with growth. Whereas the declining percentage, those that have lost 10% or more, went from 39% to 57%. So a huge shift. And I would say this is a huge shift in a very, very short period of years. This doesn't typically happen like this. But for the Episcopal Church and all other mainline denominations, even those who have not gone through the same sort of conflict that we have, the last 5 years have been particularly problematic, and these issues are also being faced by non-mainline denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention and many other more conservative denominations. Okay. This looks at some key statistical areas. We've already looked at worship attendance and membership, and as you can see, the issues that deal with sort of keeping records of who's there, whether they go all that much or not, communicants in good standing and membership both had declines of 17 and 19%, but the declines in terms of things that measure actual involvement are even greater. So at Easter, attendance is 20% drop, worship attendance is a 22% drop, and pledge cards, which is another activity that people do, is a drop of 22%. This looks at other areas of congregational life. We're obviously just not about membership and attendance. Other things go on. The smallest drop is in burials. One might think that burials would go up, but given the aging constituency in the Episcopal Church. But nevertheless, what we're dealing really here is a contraction of the overall constituency to a large degree. So we're having fewer baptisms, obviously, fewer adult baptisms. See, these declines are even larger than those in attendance and pledging. Church school has dropped 33%. Marriage has dropped even more, 41%, because it's possible to get married outside the offices of the church, and so people, if it's too much trouble or they just want to run off someplace and get married, as some people do, to avoid the family problems and whatever and the cost. Well, okay, and if you look in England, it's much more extreme, and I think in Canada as well, where fewer and fewer people are getting married in the church. But adult baptisms are down, but again, burials are the less decline there, but still a decline. Okay. This also looks at the issue of sort of the declining overall constituency of the Episcopal Church, so that not only are we having fewer increases, that is, this is individual churches reporting how many people did you take in as new members or as transfers this year? Okay, and so that was again stable in about till 2001, and then began to decline at a very just even pace, so that each year we have fewer people added to the rolls of our congregations. On the other hand, the decreases also bounced around. So in this particular time, we actually had more increases than we did decreases to congregational rolls. But then decreases increased, so that people taken off the rolls because they died, moved, transferred, whatever. But then this is also declining, so we're having fewer decreases and fewer increases, but more decreases and increases. Is it too early in the morning to talk like that? Okay, all right. It sounds like it to me. Fewer increases and decreases, but more. Okay, but that's what's happening. And in order for a denomination to grow, you obviously have to have this over that, and you need a pattern where this is going up, or at least stable, and this could be possibly declining. But this pattern is one of decline, and that's the sort of situation of which we're enmeshed. This looks at not just us, but other denominations as well. This may be a little hard to see for y'all in the back. The fact that I say y'all does indicate that I'm not from New York. But I guess that was given away by my accent anyway. The top line here is Southern Baptist, and this is the zero line. This is the line of decline here. Okay, so for many years, Southern Baptist began to sort of bounce around that. But now, for 4 years in a row, they have had a decline every year. This doesn't report 2010, but there was a report just about 2 weeks ago saying that they had declined as well for 2010. The Episcopal Church is, of course, the red line here, and it jumps around a good bit, where we had the 1 year of growth and then near stability for 3. And then now our declines have, these are percentage declines, and they are very, very similar to the green line, which is other mainline denominations, which includes the Presbyterian Church, the ELCA, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the UCC, maybe, and the Reformed Church in America. So our figures are very, very similar to them, and as you can see, again, the last 5 years have been, gone from things were declining but not really terribly to fairly serious declines every year. So this is across the board within the main line, and it also is affecting more conservative groups. Methodists have never really grown much, I say never. In the last 50 years, they haven't grown much and they haven't declined much. It's sort of more of an even keel kind of a pattern of decline, but not serious decline. So very, very large denomination, but not as much annual decline as anyone else. This may or may not be surprising to anyone here. This shows the percentage of parishes and the percentage of average Sunday attendance, that's what ASA means, by region. This is census regions. So that, I don't know, it was a little bit of a surprise to me that almost half of our attendance, the people in the pews in any given Sunday, are in the South. We have become, and I guess are becoming, more and more of a Southern denomination, even though I don't think our collective identity is that. But we have more growing churches, as you'll see, in the South, but a large proportion, 38% of our congregations are there, but 47% of our membership and attendance is there, whereas the Northeast, which I think a lot of people think of as the bastion of the Episcopal Church, has 28% of the parishes. This has implications in that if you look at the Sun Belt, that is, which would be the South plus Arizona, New Mexico, and California, that churches, Episcopal congregations, are much more likely to grow in the South and the Southern West than they are in any other parts of the country. And this is a combination of a number of things. One, the trends in population growth are still more southerly, and also, as everybody knows here, that the church is much more normative in the South than it is outside the South. So you have a more churched culture combined with greater population growth, and you get something like this. So unfortunately, this is much more difficult then for churches outside the South to see much growth, because particularly in what the so-called Rust Belt, where population has been stagnant, and also there's been an increasing lack of interest in going to church and a tendency to schedule other activities during church time. I certainly do remember when I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and was shocked to see that high school football practices were being held on Sunday morning during church time, and which didn't happen, in Nashville where I moved from. That tendency is even more so today, and it is certainly encroaching into the South, where you see maybe not football practice, but you see soccer practices and soccer games and soccer tournaments on Sunday morning, even in the South. But nevertheless, the South still is a more churched region and is more hospitable to churches. We also get into the issue of openings and closings. That is, it's hard to continue to grow as a denomination if you are not starting new congregations, because the population of the nation is increasing, and we are also necessarily losing some churches who die for various reasons on a regular basis. In the Northeast, the Midwest, and the South, we have about the same number of congregations that have closed. Now, as you saw, however, the South has disproportionately number of congregations, so that the percentage of those is higher in the Northeast and Midwest. But also the South has the largest number of openings and the largest number of new congregations. These new ones are included in this 79 here. It's just that I wanted to distinguish between churches that were really new and churches that were sort of renewed or changed status, as you will. For instance, if you had a university chapel who had been there for 80 years, and then they decided, or the diocese decided, that they should be now reporting, well, okay, then they would be not here, not new, but part of this larger group. Also, we have some mergers that take place whereby, two existing congregations close and then merge to form another one. Usually we just sort of carry over the one that they still continue in, but in some cases the diocese wants us to form a new church, and then that would also be included in the larger figure here. But these, the 62, the 34, the green ones, are actually new congregations that were started, say, in the last 5 years. As you can see, we have many, many more congregations that close than are started, with the closest being in the West and the South, but a really serious situation of losing net losses of congregation in the Northwest and Midwest. This does not count the churches in the disaffected dioceses, by the way. Those churches are held in abeyance until they work out the legal issues in almost all cases. And so you see in Virginia, some of those congregations that were listed as open but not filing are now back in quite a few cases, and that's also happening in Fort Worth as well. Part of the issues related to the decline of the Episcopal Church is related to our age structure. We are a denomination that is not elderly, but we are older than the average, the national average. 30% of our membership is age 65 and older, okay, as compared to only 13% of the American public. Now that is an enormous difference. It's not quite as severe in the middle age, 50 to 64, but still, you add these two together and you're getting basically a denomination that's much older on average than the population is. Average Episcopalian is about in their late 40s. The average American is in their 30s. So it's a big difference nationally. And one of the things going on with here is that these people aren't really having that many children. And if they are, it's with, extraordinary means, in vitro only goes so far, You could adopt, I guess, but the natural process doesn't happen. So, and if you have over here children and youth, the population 28%, we have 15%, and young adults and median adults. But this is the primary childbearing era or age group here. And so just because of, some of these people are not going to make it another 20 years, you have a higher death rate than the general population. And you have a lower birth rate because you don't have enough women in the childbearing years. So simply by, actuarials, we would probably lose somewhere between 13,000 to 15,000 people a year just with the death rate over the birth rate. So in order to grow as the Episcopal Church, we really would have to bring people in more so than we lose to other denominations, just to account for this age structure. And this is not simply about the Episcopal Church. The statistics are slightly worse for the Presbyterians. They in here? Okay, sorry about that, but it's not that much worse, but it's a little worse. The UCC, the Unitarians, Jewish congregations are even worse than that, much more severe problem. But nevertheless, within the mainline generally, this is an issue. It's also an issue to a certain extent within more conservative groups, but in general, in more conservative groups that are centered in the South, they have a higher birth rate and a younger population structure. So there's a little bit of growth built into the growth of the more conservative denominations. All right. Now, how does this affect our churches? Well, congregations that have been successful in reaching younger people, that is age 49 or younger, if that's a predominancy among their adults, those congregations are quite likely to grow. On the other hand, if those are very few of their congregations are likely to grow. So these things are related. Some churches have a healthy age structure. I mean a healthy age structure. I don't mean they are uniformly young adults. I mean they have a range of population from kids to teenagers, to young adults, to middle-aged adults, to older adults, a healthy age structure. But if a congregation is predominantly elderly, and in some cases that means predominantly elderly female, then that is a problematic for, not just for future growth, but for the renewal of that congregation, because younger people in general don't necessarily want to attend a church that has no one else like them in it, and it becomes a difficult problem. Some churches have been able to face this and sort of reincorporate median and younger adults, but it's a difficult process and has to be intentional in most cases. Another issue is simply the racial ethnic diversity. We are, like most other mainline denominations and even conservative denominations, as a result of our national history, predominantly non-Hispanic white, Anglo. 86.7% of our membership is non-Hispanic white, Anglo. The next largest group is Black or African American. This would include the Haitian immigrants, and also sort of the Afro-Caribbean, although Hispanic Latino in this chart would include his Spanish-speaking Black population. So that's mostly American-born Black African American, the 6.4%. We have relatively few Asian Pacific Islanders and quite few Native Americans. Now, what does this mean? Well, one of the things it does mean is that basically the Anglo population isn't growing hardly at all. It's growing maybe at less than 1%. And so it's going to take decades for it to increase. But on the other hand, the non-white, non-Anglo population is increasing greatly. And the lower you go in the age group, the higher the percentage. So that if you look at those under 25, in 1980, there was only 25% of the population of those under 25 was an ethnic minority. But by 2030, that group, those under 25, are going to be the majority. This is a rather enormous change, and again, in a relatively few years. So this country is becoming much, much more ethnically diverse than it was just 30 years ago, and it's going to continue. Look at those. It's the same basic trend for those in their late 20s and all the way up to 44. But again, by 2030, the racial ethnic population will be nearly the majority at that time. And so this is just going to stay. It's already happening, obviously, in the school system, but it's going to be more general in the larger society. So, again, for a denomination that's predominantly not that, that creates some issues because, if you look around this room, there's a lot of white people here, and this population isn't going to be growing much. And we don't have that many Hispanic congregations. We have some, and those kind of congregations tend to be growing. As you look over here, Hispanic congregations, 47% of them increased over the last 5 years. The next, Asian Pacific Islander, and congregations that had no one dominant racial ethnic group in them as well. So we have a lot of multiracial, multi-ethnic congregations in the Episcopal Church, and they tend to do well. Black congregations are growing about the same level as the Anglo congregations, and these would be primarily the native-born black population here, not including the black population with Hispanic roots. Native American congregations, about the same as the Anglo. A lot of these congregations are in profoundly rural areas in the West, very, just on side roads and very difficult to find, reservations and such. So not much growth is happening there either. Okay, let's talk a bit about clergy. Some of this data are from the Church Pension Group, who share their material mostly with me. They won't give me your income, but that probably makes you feel better. But they refuse to give any income data. They will give you the counts. All right, there are 18,000 priests who are alive, that is of several months ago. Yeah. What do the Methodists say? Are we yet alive? Well, they are yet alive. And of those, about 6,000 are retired. There's deacons. And so this includes both deacons and priests. And about 6,000 priests employed in the church right now. So that means in actual congregations as opposed to those who work in denominational offices, or what we used to, in the Southern Baptists used to call denominational serpents, as opposed to servants. Let's see. And the average age of non-retired priests is 56, and the average age of priesthood ordination is 46. Now, there's not a whole lot of difference between those two. Even though we have been getting in more younger ordinands in the Episcopal Church, we also have been getting in a lot of older or even older ordinands in the Episcopal Church. So the average hasn't really changed very much over the last 5 or 6 years. Still slightly more male priests overall than female priests, but it's getting closer. Ordinations versus retirements. This is the year they changed the rule. So a lot of early retirements, you know, when it was possible, what was the 30-year retirement? You could retire at full retirement after 30 years of active service. Well, a lot of people took that year. Since then, it's evened out. But in the last several years, we've had more people retiring than we have had ordinations. So if you want to interpret this as, well, are we getting out of sync in terms of the number of priests we're going to have in the future? It's a little difficult to say, because a lot of what the situation is that of, do we have enough priests in the right areas as opposed to you know, in churches. This is from the parochial report as opposed to the pension group. And so we know now that in 11.4% of churches at any given time, those churches, 11% have no called or assigned priest whatsoever. Now, these are dealing almost exclusively with supply situations, not interims, because interims are counted as either a part-time or a full-time, depending on the circumstances. But these have nobody on a regular basis. I think I don't think anybody had a sense that it was this high. Maybe some placement people did, but this is a quite high number. The ones that don't have supply are dealing with various other situations, like you know, the deacon or some person in the vestry leads worship. You know, my worst example is the church in Idaho. You want to hear this story? Okay, all right. Okay, so this is based on a 100% count. We actually contacted every single Episcopal church in America. There's no one that escaped this. So, you know, my assistant was having some trouble getting in touch with this one church, so I just said, I'll just call them. So I called this church in Idaho, and I got this woman on the phone who says, and I said, well, we're trying to find out the clergy situation. Oh, we haven't had a clergy person in a decade. I said, well, I see you only have a few members. Yeah, we only have about 5, and but I'm the only one that attends. So I said, well, okay, well, you know, just curious, but how does this happen? And she says, and this was so sad. So every Sunday, she goes down there and she reads morning prayer to herself. Yeah. So, and then once a year they have kind of a homecoming thing when various others come. But, you know, we've got some churches in some, you know, strange, kind of sad situations that are open, filing, you know, Episcopal congregations, and that's an extreme. You know, but nevertheless, it was true. And so in churches like that, tiny churches, they hold worship services in the only way they can hold worship services. And if they just read morning prayer every Sunday, that's what they do. Solo part-time or non-stipendiary, okay, so these are churches that typically would not be counted by the church pension group as having an active clergy person. But there is a priest there full-time or rather part-time, either paid or not paid. And then we have some churches that are multiple part-time or multiple non-stipendiary situations in which you have, for instance, there was this area in Texas that had like 4 churches that shared 6 clergy, all of whom were part-time. And so they all had 6 clergy on there as their priests. 20 members, but these clergy people, they just sort of rotated around and did worship services at these churches. So another unusual situation, but we got a lot of unusual things going on. And this would also include, some of the retirees here as well, either paid or not paid. And then finally, we have what would used to be the most typical situation is a solo full-time priest at about 35%, 36%. And then 11% have one full-time priest with an additional part-time, 1 or more additional part-time or non-stipendiary priest. And then the smallest category of those who have at least 2 full-time priests on staff. Okay, so this really is the first look at what our clergy priest situation is in the Episcopal Church, taking into consideration the retirees, the part-times, the non-stip, the whole bit. Next slide. Churches that have an interim or no priest at all, 48% of those churches have declined. Now, they may have declined before the interim situation occurred. We don't know that. But we know that the transition is a period of problem, and that if you have no priest at all, you're likely to be declining. We got a lot of churches, say in Long Island, where, churches might go for 2-3 years with supply priests. That's a great way to kill a church. Because it just changes from week to week. You never have any sort of commonality. The community can't develop. It's just, so I observed a church go, it was a small church anyway, but go from average attendance of 50 to an average attendance of 22 in the 2 years with, supply priest every week. Part-time or retired priests, a little bit more, 1 priest, and then churches that have multiple priests, are much less likely to decline. If you lose 1 priest in a multi-priest church, you still got 1 full-time person. You're not without a priest in those situations. So it is a correlation. This gets at, again, also the issue of, the changeover, so that if you have no priest, only 17% of those churches are growing. If the priest was called in the last 2 years, a survey was done in 2010, only 18% of those churches have grown. Now, again, some of the problems have carried over in the previous years, so that obviously these people didn't experience the growth that occurred 2 years before, or the decline that occurred 2 years before. But then in 2008, if they were called in, you have a significant amount of growth. So it takes a couple of years for things to get moving again in these congregations. Okay. We've also looked at age structure, and in general, younger helps, but not too young. This is from the Church Pension Group. This looked at multi-staff churches and what happened to them over the last 5 years. And very few churches have increased, but a lot have decreased by 1 clergy person, active clergy people. So a large number of our congregations are decreasing the number of ordained staff, that is, priests on their staff, and very few have actually added a clergy person, and then 33% have had no change. So some of this is afoot in terms of changes in the way that we staff our congregations. This is a graph that you can get for your own diocese and for your own parish online from our website. Everybody know that? Okay, good. All right. And you can also get it for any other church, any other diocese. So if you're thinking about moving or you're just going into the ministry, you know, looking around, or particularly if you're a bishop and you want to know if people are lying to you, you can look it up. Okay, and so what we've seen overall is that plate and pledge income kept up, was doing pretty well, and then it's only in the last couple of years has actually had a net decline. We were doing better than inflation for many years, even though the membership was declining. This looks at attendance, but just looking at income, the last couple of years during the Great Recession have been problematic for everybody, including the churches. Plate and pledge giving looks at it with inflation adjusted and then inflation not adjusted. And as you see, we were doing better than inflation for many years, a plateau, and then a decline against inflation, but still better than would be expected given the decline in the overall church. Capital expenses, which go into building issues, have been fairly, have been high, but steadily declining, except for in 2008. This is right before the big bubble burst, which was really in late 2008, I guess, wasn't it? Yeah, September 2008 is when, but a lot of this money was already in the process of being spent, and then it's declined steadily during the last couple of years. So less money being invested in capital activities over the last several years. Congregations in financial stress. This looks at, are you able to sort of meet expenses? Are they bad? Are they problematic? Or are you sort of just getting by? This includes those that are just getting by with those that are having problems. And we had a big increase in the number that are having some problems from 2000, 2005. It stabilized, and then it went up again in 2010. Whereas for American congregations, generally it's been a steady increase over time. This includes all groups, including Jewish synagogues and Assemblies of God, Church of God, even Muslim congregations. What helps congregations grow? It helps to have a purpose, to know what you're about, to be directed at something in general. Why are we here? What are we trying to do? Not just to accept the fact that, well, we've always been here, so that's what we do. There's a tendency among Episcopal churches to act like that. Wishing doesn't make it so, but it helps. It helps to want to grow. If you don't want to grow, you're not going to grow. So it helps to have some purpose again. And Julia talked a little bit about change issue, and change is important. Our congregation is willing to change to meet new challenges. Churches that disagree with that are quite likely to decline. Churches that strongly agree are much less likely to decline. How well does it is joyful describe your worship service as the large attendance? 35% of those churches that say it very well are likely to grow. It's really difficult to have a growing church if it has depressing worship. So don't do that. Emphasis on personal prayer, devotions, or other spiritual practices. Growing churches tend to emphasize spirituality, prayer, devotion, as well as social ministries and such. So, it's not one or the other, it's both in terms of what is related to growth and decline. Churches, growing churches, the parents talk to their children about their faith. That happens. You have to have children, of course, for this to happen. But even if you take the churches that don't have any children out, among those that have children, the ones that are growing talk to them. also are related to not having sort of a stagnant infrastructure is, you know, okay, I thought this was another. Recruiting new members. I mean, most Episcopal churches don't do Mormon-type evangelism, but they do talk to people about their faith. And you have to have you have to have a sort of a church that people are interested in before people are going to invite them to it. Does that make sense? Okay. So we do evangelism and outreach in a more organic fashion than a lot of other denominations do. But, you know, it helps to have, it's imperative to have something that you would like to invite someone else to. Letting them know you care. Growing churches have all sorts of ways of contacting people, and there are more ways to contact people now than there used to be between, you know, Facebook and Twitter and whatever, all these other social media things that, you know, particularly, you know, if you don't know how to do it, you got some, you know, ask your children. They'll tell you how. Special events. It also helps to get people into the church community who've never been there before. And this is one way to do that. Rotation of leaders in a congregation. You can't have the same people serving the same roles year after year after year and never get new people into leadership. This is essential, and it has to occur. And then conflict can kill churches. We had, you know, in churches that infight, and all churches have some manner of decline, of conflict, but multiple serious areas of conflict, particularly involving the clergy person and the leadership of the church, tend to be the worst sources of overall decline. If it's about money, people just stop giving, but they don't leave. But if it's about, you know, issues related to leadership or misconduct, both of the clergy person or lay leaders, then people tend to leave those situations. Now, to get this back to the, you know, building issues, we've been doing a study of rapidly growing congregations recently. Interviewed 10 of them over the last 6 months. And it's interesting. All of these churches are growing churches, have building needs, but they're all different. And one church in New Jersey, massive church, massive facilities, but what's the problem there? Well, one, it's falling down. Two, it's impossible to heat. And three, it's wrong. That is, the space they have isn't the space they need, because, you know, it basically was let's say, a Victorian church that was converted into, I don't know what you'd say, Gothic architecture. They built a Gothic church inside a Victorian church. It's an interesting look. Stone inside the wood. Okay, but as a result of this mishmash, you know, they had a lot of money back in the 1918, 1920s, so they did all this stuff. But they had these massive facilities, but it doesn't work for Christian education, it doesn't work for ministry, and it's impossible to heat. So they have, even though the church has tripled in membership over the last 5 years, they still have severe building issues that they need to deal with. On the other hand, we have an awful lot of churches that I would sort of built like chapels. It is, okay, you got a nice worship service facility and you got offices. And that's it. Okay. As if you're just expecting people to come there on Sunday morning, worship, have their coffee hour, and go home. There's no thought about ministry. There's no thought about Christian education. There's no thought about fellowship or anything else. So then they have to cobble around. And a church in Arizona was using donated Quonset huts and setting them up on this property in order to have facilities for people. And then, so then And the priest had to give up her office because there wasn't room. So she just had to work out of her house because they needed the facility so desperately. So this church, again, had tripled in membership over the last 5 or 6 years. But they were just having to use all sorts of strange techniques to come up with the space because the space wasn't useful. And then the third example was a new congregation that had been dealing with borrowed space, rented space, and then an inadequate first building. What do they do now? They're growing, money's tight, but how do you build for the future? So even in rapidly growing churches, it's not a panacea. Can't just expand into the space that they had previously when they were a declining congregation. Space issues come into effect, and then that leads into capital issues as well. So that's my presentation. I appreciate your attention, and thank you. Have a good day.